So as I create this video in late November 2025, Mars is about to transit my natal Mars. So I figured this is a good time to talk about Mars. So I've been working on this series, which is the theme is finding Dionysus in astrology, because Dionysus is not one of the named planets. And Dionysus is one of the most important figures in ancient religion and ancient thinking, and the absence of Dionysus um, makes me wonder, where is he? Where can you find Dionysus or Bacchus? And one of the obvious places to look is Mars. And there's many reasons why Mars has not been associated with Bacchus for a long time, partially because Mars has got a swath of territory, so to speak, of archetypal territory that is not entirely the same as Bacchus. The Mars, Mars the god, specifically, when we're talking about the Roman deity, was originally a god of agriculture, very much like Bacchus in many ways. But the original Roman culture, from what I understand, did not have quite the Bacchanalian tradition that was very alive in other parts of the Mediterranean. I could be mistaken. I'm not sure if we know exactly. But because this is, we're talking about archetypal territory here, I absolutely would put Bacchus in martial territory in a lot of ways. And at a certain point, that breaks away. When we get into religious matters, that becomes much more of a Jupiter thing. When it becomes, we're talking about pleasure and inebriation, that gets that can live in several places, but that really is kind of Venus's territory a bit more than Mars. Mars generally deals with conflict, and there is an implicit conflict when there is a birth, basically. When a new tree sprouts through the ground, this is a type of implicit conflict. Something entering the world that was not there before needs to individuate itself and claim its territory. If we think about it in a with a worldview which sort of implies conflict as being at least one of the major forces that is at work. There are many more harmonizing and non-competitive things going on in the natural world that are often overlooked, because the Darwinist kind of mindset really put us in a place where competition between species became a concept that it took up way too much space. And that being said, conflict is one of the things that is required to move the universe forward. And Mars is there with that. Conflict is not always physical conflict. Conflict can be an internal conflict of one kind or another. And Mars is the archetype that kind of monitors reality for these conflicts. and for things that would threaten our ability to survive. Mars is this very basic insistence that one must survive. This is it is a masculine principle, but this is a very interesting thing that astrology does here, because Mars is the most masculine archetype, but it sits in what's called the night sect with the moon and Venus as its companions in that sect. For people who aren't familiar with this, there are two sects of the planets. There's 7 planets divided into 2 sects, with Mercury sitting outside of those 2, with a slight tendency to prefer air signs, but other than that, a neutrality, a mercurial nature that can coalesce with either the masculine or feminine. So, given that Mars is in this feminine sect and is the most masculine planet, when you think about this makes a tremendous amount of sense, because it's by differentiating from the female that we become male. With the company of other males, we do tend to, there does tend to be a differentiation between the more masculine and the less masculine. You can look at same-sex couples, lesbians or gays. There's almost always a more masculine and a more feminine figure in those relationships. So this works even outside of the traditional context. So Mars is defining masculinity, essentially, and if femininity is messed up or excessively competitive with masculinity, or masculinity is being portrayed as completely toxic from the beginning, we have a problem, and we have that problem today, where very, very hard place right now for masculinity, because it's being plowed under largely by mainstream culture, and those who have really decided that they're not going to fall for that there's that masculinity is in fact a extremely important thing. There's a lot of not so good ideas going around in that circle. So in any case, we're in a troubled place for Mars. I think that's self-evident, which is, as a male, one needs to not care, essentially, what the mainstream thinks about it or about masculinity in general, and simply to live as a masculine male, regardless of what anybody thinks. And that's really what masculinity is not caring what other people think, to a large extent. You can learn from other people. You can, suffer, if we have this concept too of the beta male and the alpha male and whatever. And this is there are males who have allowed their masculinity to be plowed under, essentially, who've become cheerleaders for their own emasculation / castration, and this is what we would consider the your metrosexual, your the guy who's really hates masculinity, or lives in a place where he's just can't stand the idea of being anything but a doormat. These are, what I would call a beta male. Now, if a male is out there, um, even if they get, bit down on by other males regularly, that's not a beta male. That's a male who's, unless they give up, which is then they become probably that archetype. But if they're, willing to be, that's how they learn. Anybody who knows anything about martial arts, if you're going to only, take on people who are um, not as good as you without the experience you have, or even taking on people who are bigger and with more, younger. If you don't do that, you're wasting your time, and you're not a beta male if you lose. You're actually embracing the tradition if you regularly lose, and that's how we learn, and that's the it's often described that the male who gets put in his place suffers a trauma, and that is can be true, especially at a young age. We certainly know that masculinity can be damaged, especially at a young age, through things like circumcision or other assaults on the literally on the masculinity. That does cause sublimated problems for the male. But the thing about masculinity is actually that not to deny one's trauma, but to live with that trauma and always be in a place where one is trying to transcend that. And that's not a denial of what's real, but it's rather an aspiration. So Mars, I wrote recently about Mars literally going from being an agricultural god to being a god of war, and this is what's called archetypal drift. When an archetypal character literally starts to shapeshift into something else, and that can be done in several ways, and it generally has to be done and it's guided. The case of Mars, historically speaking, Mars had like 2 temples in all of the Roman Empire at one point, until I guess it was Augustus became the emperor, and then the cult of Mars became huge, and he became really the patron of the Roman military, which was incredibly disciplined and renowned, obviously, for its prowess. And what I said is that Mars essentially got conscripted, this archetype put into service, essentially. And if like I've described Mars as individuation, and that's absolutely what Mars is. But if this martial energy does not have a higher purpose, and it's simply invested into the bacchanalian activities, where it's simply lascivious and red-faced and just getting angry at everything, or indulging in the all of the highly emotional aspects and self-destructive aspects and oversexed and all of the things that Mars can sort of degenerate Mars. That being said, Mars without the essential sexual aspect, if that becomes plowed under again, if it gets taken away and starts to invest in a idea of androgyny, then Mars is in big trouble. The martial archetype, again, this is Mars in the feminine world, delineated from the female. And again, women have Mars too, and this is extremely important to understand, but I'm speaking about Mars in the male psyche right now. Mars absolutely must have a higher purpose, and conscripting Mars into the Roman army is not. It's a mixed thing, because Mars needs to remain masculine and individuated, but it also needs to learn not to break ranks. It needs to know that it has to have discipline. It's got to be, it has to be invested in a higher earthly purpose, which is why Mars is in many ways doesn't belong in a temple, except for in so far as that celebrates this martial impulse and keeps it alive as it is a spiritual impulse. It's very much so. And when we talk about martial arts, there's no Jupiterian arts. I mean, there are, but that's not something that we talk about as much. The martial tradition is extraordinarily important, and we can see if you look at kittens and little puppies, they attack each other by nature. This martial play is hardwired into the animal world, and we are of that world, but we have an incredible capacity for understanding the body and lifting things up, where this really becomes an art form, and it grounds the human in the body, and it's absolutely essential to preservation of the masculine spirit, because, as I said, it's defined by its relationship to the feminine, and largely to its ability to protect. But it also needs to not care what anybody thinks, and we wouldn't be living in the situation we are with masculinity being essentially under assault if it weren't probably the most important archetype. The whole, what's called the day sect, the masculine planets, they sit on top of Mars to do what they do. If Mars is dysfunctional, they don't have a chance. They really don't. So, all right, I hope this helps anybody who's interested in this martial archetype. This is, if you're an astrologer and you don't know what to say about Mars, hopefully you can use some of this information to flesh out your understanding of this archetype. I could probably do hours on this, and if people are interested, I am intending to finally do a class where we go over all of the archetypes in this Dionysian, with this Dionysian lens, and that can really, if you get into mythology and you get into this doctrine of sect, where you're dividing them into two groups, and then you start to see what and I didn't even talk about Mars as a malefic, which is, I've spoken about that before. Mars is the malefic of the night sect, because He is the dissenting voice in many ways. He protects it, but he also interrupts it, and he also basically he's the pressure valve that allows the masculine world, the solar world, to exist in our psyche, where we're not all bound up in a eternal womb-like animalistic type mindset, which is ironic because Mars is in many ways part of that animalistic mindset. But as I said, this is where we emerge from it, and it's on his shoulders that all of the solar world sits. And I can also speak about how the decans work with that. They quite literally illustrate that point. And the decans are 10-degree sections of the zodiac. The whole thing is set up to favor Mars, to show you that Mars is what drives the entirety of the zodiac, despite it being a malefic, and despite it, largely being misunderstood as an archetype. My website is michaelmsuter.com, and you can also find me on Substack.